Julie Dahl-Wittes, and I'm currently a postdoc in the agronomy department. I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Basalla to bring her to campus for this event. And I also have the honor of introducing her today. But before I do that, I'd like to take a minute to explain the format of today's event and to thank all of our sponsors. So Dr. Basalla will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for questions for another 45 minutes. Following that, please join us for a reception just outside these doors where Dr. Basalla will be available for more discussion. We're very grateful to the many sponsors of this event, including the Graduate School's Office of Professional Development and Engagement, the Office of Graduate Studies and Professional Development through CALS, the School of Medicine and Public Health, the Departments of Agronomy and Horticulture, the Graduate Student Collaborative, the Plant Science Graduate Student Council, and the Wisconsin Alumni Association. And I would also like to thank Amber Robertson and Susan Bush for helping to initiate this event, and Eileen Callahan, Kathy Matthews-Risley, and Jennifer Taylor from the Graduate School for handling all of the logistics for today. Next Wednesday and Thursday, there are some professional development events on campus that you may be interested in as well. Wednesday's event is called Identifying Transferable Skills for Careers Outside the Academy. And Thursday's event is called Mastering the Non-Academic Interview. And more information on these and other events can be found on the Graduate School's website. So now a few words about our invited guest. Through her own career journey, our speaker today discovered that the talents that make you successful in academia can help you thrive outside of academia as well. She has found that the greatest obstacle to a PhD's employment outside of academia lies inside his or her own head. And while recognizing that each person's career decision is very highly personal, Dr. Basalla helps guide academics to treat their career exploration as another research project, and to recognize that academic life is, as she puts it, one of about 10 million possible careers. Dr. Basalla is Managing Associate and Project Director at Art and Science Group, a Baltimore-based consulting firm focused on higher education. She received her PhD in English from Princeton University and worked in journalism and new media for 6 years before her current position. She has been a regular contributor to the Chronicle of Higher Education's Beyond the Ivory Tower column since 2002. While in graduate school, Dr. Basalla began researching careers for PhDs outside of academia and contacted dozens of graduate alumni to ask for advice. In talking with PhDs who worked in careers ranging from private investigator to midwife, inspired her to co-author a career guide for academics called So What Are You Going to Do With That? Finding Careers Outside Academia. And through this book, Dr. Basalla had such a positive influence on my career path that I asked her to speak to us because I wanted others to be able to benefit from her message as I had. So after graduating with my PhD last May, I was confused about my career path. Should I take the next logical step and do the professorship tenure track, even though my heart wasn't in it? Or should I what? I didn't know what options I had. So it was during that time that I found Dr. Basalla's book. And by reading and really working through the exercises in the book, I was able to identify my skills and career desires, discover how I could apply them outside of a professorship, and also learn how to market my skills and PhD to those outside of academia. And because of that, I'm very grateful that I've been able to find a wonderful job, which I'll start in a few months. So it's a real honor for me to introduce someone who's had such a profound effect on my life, and I'm thrilled that she's here to share her message with us today. So please help me welcome our special guest today, Dr. Susan Pasala.
Hello. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, I'm kind of loud in general, so you can tell me to pipe down. I just want to say thank you again to all of the sponsors that Julie mentioned. I appreciate so much the efforts that Julie and Amber and Susan went through to write a grant proposal to fund my trip here, and I appreciate very much that they were undaunted by the fact that that grant didn't work out and went around and lobbied across campus to many organizations who contributed to bring me here. So I really appreciate that. It's a wonderful thing. And I'm glad to see such a fantastic turnout. I'm very glad to have you all here. First, I want to find out who you all are in sort of a quick survey type format. Who else in the humanities? Excellent. Who's social sciences? Pure sciences? I thought so. Engineers? Are you in there? How about like professional school, other categories I haven't mentioned? No, okay. Yes, okay, great. Who's a first year? Wonderful. It's never too early. I'm always glad to see first years. Never too early. Second years? Very nice. Third years? Good. Fourth years? Okay, fifth year and anything higher, I won't judge. Okay. Postdocs, faculty type folk? Okay, great, good. Well, I'm glad to have you all here. I should say, first of all, I'm going to sort of shorthand and talk about PhDs or grad students, but I mean everybody. I mean whether you plan to finish, I mean whether you're terminal masters, I mean any person who's been accepted into a graduate program, basically. So if I say PhD and you're thinking to yourself, but I'm not sure I'm going to finish, or I'm in terminal masters, everything applies to you just as well. So I want to say that before I forget. So I'm going to tell you a little bit quickly about myself and how this book came to be, and then I'm going to run through 5 sort of do's and don'ts in the job hunting process. And starting with my background, as Julie said, I finished my PhD in 1997, so I've been living on the outside for about a decade now. And in those years, right after I finished my PhD, I had a number of jobs. I was a temp. I was not a very good receptionist. I was a research assistant at a foundation. I was a waitress at a bistro. I was a junior reporter for a trade newsletter on medical technology devices, which sounds really bad, but was actually a really great job. I worked for The Motley Fool, which was a .com. I got laid off from The Motley Fool because it was a .com. I was unemployed for about 9 months after the .com boom, and watched a lot of Food Network and freelanced for about 9 months. Got a job at America Online after that, which was a horrible job. And that was about 7 years from the time I finished my PhD. Because my pet peeve in hearing stories about what people do after academia is they make it sound like I graduated and then I went into the job I have 10 years later. And there's a lot of intermediate steps on the way. So that whole time, those 7 years when I was doing all these different jobs, I was also very busy on the side. I was writing this book with my best buddy from grad school, Maggie DeBelius, and we managed to get it published. And then once we got it published, I was writing for the Chronicle and begging universities to please let me come give talks like this one. So I was doing all of that on the side while working my day jobs. And at that point when I was laid off, that was really a turning point for me, because I thought, when is that great day going to be where the thing I do for money during the day is going to converge with this passion that I have for higher education and for bringing out the best in graduate programs? When are these things going to come together? This thing I do on weekends and this thing I do during the week. And so being unemployed actually gave me an opportunity to really focus on bringing those two things together. I did a lot of networking and I got lucky. And so after 7 years, I finally started work for Art and Science Group, a higher education consulting firm, where I've finally been able to bring together skills that I had from my day job and my personal interest in higher education. So Julie talked a little bit about how this book came to be, and I'll give you a little more of the personal side of it. Julie and I were just comparing notes about sort of what our stories were, and we were joking about people who leap from academia and those who are pushed. And I was, and there's no shame in either, but I was a leaper. I was in about my 3rd year, and I just started to realize that I didn't feel it in my gut. I didn't feel it in my heart. And my father was a history of science professor. He had retired, and I grew up in a college town, and I just always thought that would be my life. What a great life to live. And I always pictured that for myself. But I was watching my friends go on the job market a couple years ahead of me, and I realized that they were just, racking their brains and tearing their hair out over jobs that they didn't even really want in places where they didn't really want to live. And then they still weren't getting the jobs anyway. And I started to think about this, that I went in completely naive about what the chances were of my getting a tenure track position, much less a tenure track position somewhere I wanted to live. And I started thinking, okay, what about the best case scenario? What if I was offered a job at Harvard or University of Hawaii or some fabulous place, or maybe a little ski place in Vermont, and I still couldn't get excited. And I thought, that's not a good sign. If the best case scenario doesn't warm me, then I think this may be the wrong path. But I had no idea what the alternative would be. So my plan was, I'm going to get this degree no matter what. I'm going to get it quickly, and I'm going to get out. My co-author, Maggie, will tell you that I'm insane. She would never do it that way. She took the totally opposite approach. She took a full-time job at a .com, wrote her dissertation on weekends, and finished about 3 or 4 years later. But for her, that was the only sane way she could imagine doing it. She'll tell you I'm crazy. I couldn't have done it her way. But my way was, I had a 4th year that was still funded, and I cut a deal with my advisors, and I said, look, I'm never going to go on the market. You're never going to have to write a letter of recommendation for me. I just want to finish, and can I finish in my 5th year? And I told my parents, and I thought, oh, my father's going to be so disappointed. And my father said, oh, thank God. We thought we were going to have to support you for the rest of your life. So thanks, Dad. So we made a deal that they would help me out a little bit in my 4th year, and I wouldn't teach. So I would just finish the dissertation. So that was my goal. I just wrote as fast as I could. And while I was doing that, I was also making those phone calls that Julie talked about, trying to figure out what people did. And actually, some members of my department were very supportive, put me in touch with the alumni office. I had no idea. I mean, the alumni office knows everything about everybody. So I just looked up other PhDs in English, and you could see where they lived and what their occupation was. And if their occupation was anything other than professor, I would call them up. And, I'd heard rumors about these people, and now I had their names. And it was so interesting because in the rumors, it was like these people who were no longer academics were talked about like Sasquatch, just wandering across the frozen tundra, howling piteously and exiled from the warmth and light of the university. And lo and behold, these people were not Sasquatch on the phone. They were happy and well-adjusted and fulfilled in their lives and spoke in complete sentences. And they were so warm and friendly. And I thought, wait a minute, there's something going on out there. And what was also really wonderful is that it was kind of like a secret fraternity. They were really happy to talk to me because not a lot of people understood this particular club that we were in. So I was amazed by how generous they were. I just kept writing down the stories. I had no idea what I was doing. I put them on note cards because that's what you do as a grad student. I had them on note cards. And then I would call Maggie and I'd say, you're not going to believe who I found. This person is so interesting. And finally she said, we just got to write a book about this. You know how our friend Lisa always says, I don't want to be an academic anymore, but I can't imagine what else I'd do. She said, but this is it. We can help people imagine what else they could do. And then they can make their choice. So that was how the book started. So over the next couple of years, while I was working different day jobs and while she was still in grad school, we kept interviewing people, hundreds of people by the time we were done, leaned more towards humanities and social sciences than pure sciences and engineering, I will admit up front. But I think the principles are the same, and there's also some fantastic books out there that are just designed for science students. So we're not trying to cover their territory necessarily. We talked to people who were right out of grad school, people who were looking back decades later, people who were Hollywood producers, people who were humdrum editors, and we talked to greeting card writers, as big a range of occupations as we could find. And we also came up with a word that we tried to use throughout the book that I should define for you, and the word is post-academic. And the origin of it is actually pretty simple. We just made it up because we didn't like alternative careers. We didn't like non-academic careers because when you think about what's behind those terms, there's this worldview that there are two paths that any human being can take in life. You can either be a professor or you can be anything else in the known universe except a professor. So, Rachel Ray and astronauts and Bernie Madoff and the Domino's guy are all in this box, and then everyone else whose faculty is over here. And we just thought, this is a little bit limiting. So the other important thing about post-academic for us, though, is that it was post-academic, because we realized that one of the patterns that emerged in all these stories was that people didn't slam the door on everything that they loved about academia or graduate study and just walk away in a different direction and never look back. No, they actually found ways to continue holding on to what they loved, finding different ways to pursue interests and use skills that they enjoyed using. They just did it in a different context. So it wasn't this U-turn. It was more of a parallel path. And we wanted to reinforce this, that it wasn't anti-academic, it was post-academic. So let me give you some do's and don'ts. They're actually going to be don'ts, because I want to point out some of the cultural differences between the academic job search and the post-academic job search. And actually, those workshops that Julie just mentioned sound like fantastic ways to get at some of these things on a real practical level. When it comes to looking for a job outside academia, your obstacles often are in your own head, not necessarily through your own fault, but because you've been acculturated into a very different kind of job search. I mean, the academic job search, it just sounds insane to anybody outside academia. You have openings once a year? What? And you have very little say over where you're going. You get hired at conferences and you interview on beds in hotel rooms. I mean, it's just a very odd universe. And you know, it's a committee and you can't network. You can't schmooze your way into an academic job. Maggie actually worked outside academia before she went to grad school, and she made the mistake of calling someone and trying to sort of network the way you would outside academia. And she got flagged as sort of an ethical violation. I mean, it's just very different cultures. And so the more you know going in, the smoother the process is. So I think the biggest difference, though, at heart there is that the difference is active versus passive. I mean, an academic job search is relatively passive because you've got a credential that just stamps you and makes it really simple for everyone to see that if you have a PhD in political science, you can fulfill the requirements of being an assistant professor in political science. It's just a given. And that doesn't mean that what hiring committees do isn't important, but it means that they're focusing not on your basic competence, but on these very small but very important differences in your specialty and in your collegiality, in the area you study, et cetera. But those things look insane to people outside academia. They think all those people can do the same thing. But the difficulty is, if you're used to that kind of job search, where you pour your entire experience onto a CV and hand it to someone, and they can pretty much decide to hire you almost on the basis of that, because really everything they need to know is there. Well, if you take that attitude outside into the rest of the world, you will fail miserably, because employers don't want to know the superfine details of your experience, but more importantly, there's no credential that's carrying all the weight for you. You have to carry the weight. You have to argue. You have to make a very active case for yourself and be persuasive, you know, like you're arguing in front of a jury. You have to persuade people that you can do the job in a way that you never have to as an academic. So there's sort of this shift from leaning back to leaning forward. And I think that's the biggest cultural difference. And I'll talk about a couple ways that it plays out in the search. The first one is, my first don't for you, is don't mistake your dissertation for your greatest accomplishment. And I know that's sort of heretical. But first, it's kind of true in academia that, you know, I often heard my advisors say, you know, a dissertation is not a book. It's not your book. You'll fix it later. It's, you know, it's your dissertation. And in science, you know, it's not your lab. You're working in someone else's lab. So even within academia, your dissertation is not the end-all, be-all. But I'm not saying that it's not a great accomplishment in and of itself. I mean, just starting a dissertation is a great accomplishment. Just procrastinating on a dissertation is a great accomplishment, and I would argue worth as much in the outside world as actually finishing one. And I will explain why. Because the process of formulating a problem, structuring an argument, and actually going through that process, whether you produce that work at the end or not, that's what's valuable. It's not the content. I have yet to be asked about Zora Neale Hurston's folk tales in the workplace. I keep hoping it never comes up. It never comes up. But the skills that I learned in formulating a broad intellectual question and marshaling the resources to answer it come up every day. And when I interview, I usually use this analogy to sort of explain why would I want to hire someone. You know, how is your experience relevant to me? That's usually the question. It's not that people are hostile to academics. They just see us as kind of irrelevant. Why does that help me? And this is the argument that I make. I say, look, I am like a green beret of information. Or if you don't want to do military, you're like the Iron Chef of information. That you can just throw this mountain, this chaotic mess of information at me, and I am going to find my way through it. I'm going to sort it out. I'm going to separate what's important from what's not important. I'm going to find patterns. I'm going to develop strategies and analyze them and deliver results more effectively than anybody else. And any person in this room can say that, whether you're a first year, whether you're a fifth year, whether you're a double-digit year. That is the benefit of graduate training, that skill. And that's the most marketable thing you have to offer. And on the one hand, it may feel a little painful to think, but what about all this content knowledge? I'm a subject expert on something, and doesn't that count? Not so much outside academia. Sometimes it can be parlayed, but I think it's a very common mistake to start with your subject matter expertise and think that'll get me where I want to go. It's a perfectly valid path to try, and it works for some and it works for others. My first thought was, okay, I've been studying Zora Neale Hurston. I think I want to be, somehow I came up with like corporate diversity trainer. And I didn't really know what that was or where it went or how it worked, but like, to me, that's what my subject matter kind of formulated for me. And it was only when I backed up and looked at my skills that I found a path that made more sense for me. There's an upside too, though, to this sort of focus on the benefits of the process of the dissertation rather than the subject matter. And that's that if you're someone who doesn't finish their dissertation, or someone who wrote on an unfashionable product or an unfashionable topic, or had a really cantankerous advisor, or any of the other tragedies that can befall you, the rest of the world doesn't care. Those things don't matter, and you're on a totally level playing field. Things that would doom you in an academic search just don't matter outside of it. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that 99% of the world, a question I get asked almost every time I give a talk is, how do I explain, and what they really mean is, how do I apologize for not finishing my dissertation in a job interview? And trust me, 99.9% of people have never finished a PhD or started one, and they think you're weird for actually finishing. They totally get that you left, that you didn't want to be a part of that. It's harder to explain sometimes why you did the thing and what the value was. And I can talk more, if you remember to ask me in Q&A, I'll talk more about how to talk about your decision to finish or not finish. But really, it's one of the biggest sort of insecurities and foibles, I think, that we bring into job interviews, this need to apologize for not finishing. Nobody cares. And so all of this is really about the emotional and the psychological side of making a decision to look outside academia, whether you end up working there or not. But it's a really important process to think about where you are psychologically. If you're kind of clinging too tightly, if you're defensive, if you feel ashamed about your academic experience or unsure that you're legit enough to work outside academia, it's going to come through. And some of the most common symptoms are having a resume that looks exactly like your CV. If you're not crying in the process of changing your CV to a resume, you're not doing it right, I'll tell you. Because it's traumatic. It is traumatic. I'm telling you, that's how you know you've done it right, that it's a good resume. The other symptom is in job interviews, you can't stop talking about your dissertation topic. And my friend Maggie actually had this happen to her. She was interviewing someone who was a Renaissance scholar, and it was a group interview with Maggie and a couple of her colleagues, and she kind of said, look, I think this is a good guy, bring him in. And her colleague asked the guy, so what was your dissertation about? Which is a polite question, polite, like 2-minute answer at most. 45 minutes later, he's still lecturing on bodily humors, and they're just, they're kind of nauseated and bored, and it's a really clear sign that you need to step away from the process. Okay, so that's number one. Don't mistake your dissertation for your greatest accomplishment. Number two is don't spend more time on the classifieds or on monster.com than you do on networking. And I know we all hate networking. It just feels weird. It feels pushy. It feels awkward. Nobody likes to do it. But it actually, when you get some traction, it can be enjoyable. But until you get to that point, I have some strategies for making it bearable and for getting you through it and for getting the most out of it. So the first is a strategy for networking when you know what you're trying to get. And then the second one is a strategy for networking when you have no idea what you want to do with your life and you're just kind of putting out feelers and trying to figure out, how do I figure out in a university setting what I might want to do outside of a university setting? So let's say you have a specific kind of dream career in mind. And it can be completely impractical. It's perfectly fine. Or it can be very practical. It might be that you want to work in documentary film. It could be that you want to work with gifted middle school students on science. Maybe, did I do that? I think I might have. That was very dramatic. The what now? I can talk. I must have leaned on something. Is it? Yeah, I can talk. There you go. Clearly, technical skills, not part of my...
So someone went to go find the AV person, but as long as Sue doesn't mind talking in the dark.
I can talk in the dark. A little mood lighting. Excellent. Okay, so we're talking about how to network when you have some kind of target, like busting into Google or Antiques Roadshow or whatever your dream is. So how do you do this? I'm just going to break it down to the simplest steps so that it's not so traumatic and painful, and it's a cakewalk if you do it this way. So the first thing you do, you take your target and you stalk people. You go to the alumni office, you Google like crazy, you go to the websites and look up the staff bios, and you just look for someone to hunt down. And it's great if you can find someone who has something in common with you, like a graduate degree in their background. Maybe they're from your home state, maybe they went to school with you, maybe they run marathons. You can lie and say, you run marathons too. It doesn't matter. Just just locate a person. And there's so much information out there that you can find a person to talk to. So what you do then is you email them. Some people say call. I'm not a fan of the calling. It kind of interrupts your day. You have to schedule a time. It's awkward. I advocate emailing and introducing yourself very quickly, 1 sentence, 2 sentences, and say, could I ask you 2 questions by email about breaking into your field? I'm changing careers. And that's it. And this formula is really important. 2 questions, that's it. I'm not going to take a lot of your time. Breaking into the field, changing careers, that means I'm not going to hit you up for a job and make it really awkward where you're going to have to say, no, we're not hiring right now. And really, what kind of jerk says, no, I can't answer 2 questions by email? It's just much more convenient and low-key. And I've given this advice many times, and people will email me from the audience the next day and say, I did it, it works. And it does work. It really does work. People are flattered to be contacted. So what do you ask people? You ask them about changing careers. You say things like, what kind of experience does an entry-level hire have in your industry? Are there, and you tailor it to whatever's appropriate, but are there classes that people take? Is there a training program? Is there a particular kind of volunteer experience? Is there software I should know? How does someone go from having no experience to having the right level of entry-level experience? Because it's all about breaking in and changing careers. So you don't want to say sort of, how do you like your job? What do you do all day? Focus on, how do I get the experience to get an entry-level hire? And so they'll write back, 9 times out of 10, and give you an answer. And then what do? Then you say, thank you so much, that's fantastic. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna be, working on this career path for a while. Would it be okay if I check back in with you, down the road if I have a couple more questions for you? And of course they'll say yes. And there you go. Now you've got somebody in your network. And months later down the road, something may come up. Maybe you took that software course, or maybe you have a more refined understanding of what you're after, and you want to check back in with them. Now you've got this person who's kind of in your corner. Maybe months down the road, you say, you know what? I got some of that experience. I've drafted a resume. Would you mind taking a look at it for me? Maybe you do that down the road. But you want to just cultivate a network slowly and thoughtfully as you go along. So that's one way to do that. If you're trying to figure out what to do, you have no idea what you're doing, and you're saying, I have no idea how to even figure out what's out there because I haven't done anything but go to school for a long time. How do I know what else is out there? Which was the boat that I was in. So I borrowed this idea. It's called the gracious note, and I borrowed it from a woman named Carolyn C., who teaches creative writing out in the UC system. And she requires all of her student writers to send gracious notes to writers they admire. But I'm adapting it for us to recommend writing gracious notes to anyone or anything that inspires you. So whether it's you hear a really cool story on NPR, or whether you buy this new accessory for your road bike and it just makes you really happy and you want to write to them. Maybe it's an article you read about a principal at a charter school who's doing something really cool. Maybe it's the guys who started some microbrewery that you think is really great. It doesn't matter. Anything at all. There's no judging. There's no right and wrong answer. There's no being ashamed that you're really turned on by something so silly. Just pay attention to things that excite you or touch you or inspire you or move you, no matter what direction they're in. And then you write them a gracious note. So the rules of the gracious note. First of all, this is all about good karma, and that means handwritten notes. It's a well-known fact that karma is harder to recognize by email. If you only have email, that's fine. It's perfectly fine. The universe will work with it. But I recommend handwritten if you can. And it's just a 3-sentence note, and it asks for nothing. So the first sentence is just introducing yourself. Your second sentence, you compliment their work. Tell them what it was that inspired you to write that note. And in the third sentence, you just say, I'm so looking forward to seeing what you do next. And that's it. And sometimes you'll get a wonderful response back. A lot of times you'll get nothing back. But the point isn't to get anything back in this case. There's actually 2 purposes. One which is very woo-woo, new agey, and one which is very practical. And you can take either or both. The woo-woo, new agey side is that you're noticing things in the universe that inspire you, and you're connecting yourself to them. And so you're making some kind of bridge between things that interest you and yourself. And you're putting something out there into the world. Only something good is going to come of that. Now, on the practical side, if that just makes you sneeze, then on the practical side, think about these notes as a way of identifying what you care about. And maybe for 3 months, you'll just dash off notes whenever something strikes you and just keep a little list of the things that inspired you. And at the end of 3 months, look back and say, is there any pattern to this? What are the things that are driving me? Are they all connected to food? Are they all connected to travel? What is it that's connecting these threads? Are they entrepreneurs that I'm noticing? Are they all journalists? And you can learn a lot about what inspires you that way. Oh, hello. Hi. I think I did this. I think I leaned my clipboard on that. That's it. Thank you. Excellent. I'm going to keep my clipboard off there now. I've learned my lesson. Oh, thank you. It's on. I don't know. Is this one on? Okay. Yeah, I can talk with this one. Yeah, you good? It's on. Is it on now? Yeah. Okay. How's that? I'll use both. A little feedback. Okay. All right. So gracious notes, the new age advantage, the practical advantage. Final thought on networking. So networking I think the reason that networking is so frustrating and so unpopular, although unfortunately it's also the #1, hands down, best way to get a job. The reason that none of us really like it at first is that it's completely nonlinear. You can put in 40 hours a week of networking and get nothing. You can put in 10 minutes and get something fantastic. And you just have to know that going in, that this is about making connections, generating some possibilities, and just sitting back and seeing what happens, because you never know what's going to turn up. You might turn up exactly what you want, but a year later. You might turn up something that is slightly to the left of what you were looking at, but equally good. And you're going to build this network of people that you can go to as you have other ideas and other things that you're seeking out. You'll have that group of people that, for example, you've been emailing those 2 questions to. And in my case, when I was unemployed, I remember I had the flu, and I was so sick of being unemployed. And I found this person who, it was on the Works For Us listserv. Does anybody look at that? It's a great resource. It's basically a listserv of graduate students looking to work outside academia. And I saw this person mentioned who worked for an educational consulting firm in Baltimore, the firm I work for now, and she was a PhD in English. And so I wrote her and said, wow, hey, would love to meet you, love to have a chat. I'm going to be in Baltimore, could we have coffee? And we got together, and she told me how great the firm was and how wonderful and how I seemed like a really great fit, and they weren't hiring and they had no turnover, and good luck. And I just remember driving home and just being so depressed that, oh, well, glad she has a fantastic job, but what am I going to do? So 2 years later, I'm in my horrible cubicle at America Online, and I get an email out of nowhere that this person is now getting married, moving to Chicago, has to leave the job, and they're hiring her replacement, and she immediately thought of me. And she dug up my email address from 2 years ago from our coffee and called me and said, I hope you're going to apply for this job. I think you'd be great. And so I had an inside track, and I went into the interview saying, I've wanted to be here for 2 years. And so, I had completely forgotten about that opportunity, and that's just how it works. You can't force these things, but you have to do them so that something can unfold for you. So third, don't underestimate the value of your non-academic pursuits. And I really do mean non-academic here. I mean everything you do in graduate school that isn't officially related to your graduate work. These things are incredibly important. And depending on the tone in your department or in your school, that can also be total heresy. I know for me in my program, it was unacceptable to have other interests. And the idea for many in academia is that you just have to keep yourself pure and unsullied by other worldly things. And so if you just stay on the narrow path and you only watch PBS and you never read a novel for pleasure and no reality TV and no hobbies and ideally no personal relationships, if you're really going to go all the way through, that when the rapture comes, you will be ascended into the tenure-track job, right? And lo and behold, there is no rapture and nobody's getting ascended. So, and on the sad side, we all know people who who were the perfect models of teachers and scholars and fantastic colleagues, and they didn't get their reward in heaven, as Sarah Palin said of Joe Biden's first wife. But, there is no reward for the purity. Sorry, Sarah Palin just gets in my head sometimes. It's okay. It's okay. It didn't happen. It's okay. So anyway, being pure doesn't have its rewards. And so we have to let that go. So what else does that leave us? Well, the truth is that not only do outside interests not hurt you, and feel free to hide your life and your happiness and your balance from your advisors if you need to. I'm all for that. Go ahead. But these things not only will not hurt you, they're actually going to help you significantly. And I have 2 reasons for saying that. This was another pattern that we saw in writing the book, that over and over again when we talked to people and said, well, how did you make the transition? How did you make that step from inside, outside academia? And over again, people said, it was this little job that I was just doing for some cash on the side, or this little volunteer thing over here, or I just, I had this summer job because I'd always had this interest in, tropical fish. And then all of a sudden, it turned into a full-time job. I realized I had skills, or they asked me to stay, and that gave them the path. And, so one example, for example, was a guy who actually he was ascended to the tenure track, and he was teaching at a public university in Texas, and he was just miserable. He just fish out of water, not happy, and he decided he had to get out. And as he thought back to, what have I done, what have I enjoyed, what he remembered was lobbying the administration for better health insurance for graduate students. And that was really the experience that mattered the most to him in grad school. And so he played that up, and he is now a lobbyist for the American Library Association and loves it. Found that was a great experience. I also talked to a guy who was a runner, and he was an English PhD, and he was just, one of those obsessive, he'd probably be an ultramarathoner today, and he would just write articles and submit them to Runner's World because he was just so excited about his training. And after a couple of freelance submissions, they said, you're really good. Would you like to work here? Why don't you apply? And that ended up being his path. So you never know how these things are going to pay you off. Because really, it's this combination of the graduate degree kind of lays the foundation. Okay, she's a smart cookie. He's a smart cookie. We got that. But what do you have that's relevant to me is what employers are saying. I get that you're smart. Okay, what's relevant? The great thing is that because you have the benefit of the doubt in the brains department, all you need is a little tiny bit of volunteer experience, of low-level paid experience, anything you can point to that's relevant to an employer. It can just be a month or two, and that's enough to tip you over. But so those little tiny units of experience are really valuable. The other benefit of the other interests, and this is where Maggie would be nodding violently, is that it can just help you stay sane and be more balanced and finish more quickly. We've met a lot of people who just did something else, took a different job, worked on their dissertation on weekends, and finished 5 years later, happy as a clam. It just worked better that way. Other people, didn't go that dramatically, but they just felt that if they kept their dissertation in perspective, if it wasn't just, wow, I have to work on my dissertation for 9 hours today, it actually went more quickly when it was just one of another series of things in their lives. So the bottom line is just don't put your life on hold. Whatever you do, enjoy yourself now. A decade's a long time, so live well. The fourth one is don't be afraid to start low. One interviewee said, you get used to feeling like a nothing in graduate school, but on the other hand, you feel too educated to take on an entry-level job. I mean, that'd be insulting, right? I was a graduate student, so it's hard to gauge your place in the outside world. There isn't an obvious level for you. Do you go in with, do you belong with the people who are just out of college? Because you were just teaching those people, right, who were just out of college? Or do you go in there with the MBA folks or, people with other more specialized professional degrees? You're a different person than they are. So it's very hard to find your niche at first. So his last thought was, you've got the smarts, but you don't have the experience. And he's exactly right. The truth is that anyone who changes careers has to pay their dues in some form. You have to start low, no matter who you are. So it's not news for academics. The advantage that you have is what I was just describing, that tiny bit of experience moves you up very, very quickly. There's also a real advantage to being surrounded by people who you could have been teaching a little while ago. My first job, my first real full-time gig at that newsletter that I was talking about, I was hired along with all of these students straight out of bachelor degree programs at really good liberal arts colleges. It was me. I was, 27, 28, had a PhD, and I'm with all the 22-year-olds. And we're all on the same playing field. It was a little bit humiliating, and my boss was younger than me. And at first I thought, oh, this is going to be horrifying. And then I quickly realized, okay, I have no idea what I'm doing, so it's good he's my boss, so I'm okay with that. And then, I liked all the people I worked with, and then I realized that the great thing about being hired and compared to people who used to be your students is that they're the people who used to be your students. So you can think and work circles around them. So in 6 months, I was promoted to editor. The average track for those students was 2 years. So they couldn't figure out what was the difference, how come she got promoted more quickly? And it was just that I brought that power of analytical thinking and ability to organize information and maturity that they didn't have. And any decent employer is more than happy to accelerate someone who's working that well. I mean, they're interested in you performing well. So being surrounded by 22-year-olds, not a bad thing. And I guarantee you won't be there long. One of the great stories I heard was from a guy who was a psychology PhD, and he started after a number of other jobs, he ended up starting his own biotech public relations firm in New York. And he had a soft spot for hiring PhDs and MAs, so he would actively recruit from graduate programs around the city. But he learned sort of through trial and error that he couldn't start them at a high level. And he remembered deep, he had a scarring personal anecdote about starting out on Wall Street and being put with the 22-year-olds and paid like the 22-year-olds. And he said, hey, I should be paid more. I have a PhD. And the HR person said, well, that's really nice, but it's just not relevant here. So that kind of stuck in his craw. And he started out by hiring PhDs in biology, for example, to work at his firm. And he started them up at a high level, thinking about his own experience. But what he found is that when he started people above the level of their actual experience, as opposed to the level of their intelligence, they would screw up. They didn't have background, they didn't have the skills, they would inevitably trip over their lack of experience, and then they would be wildly resented by everyone around them, and it would be very hard for them to recover. And it just wasn't a good path. But what he found was, if I start them at the bottom and explain that if you do well, the faster you catch on, the faster you get the experience and the skills you need, I'll promote you as fast as you want. I'll promote you in 6 weeks, if that's what it takes. I have no problem with that. And he found that path worked beautifully. And so that's what he does. And people accelerate at their own pace. And I think it's a really good model to keep in mind. And it's something I've always tried to manage in my own career, that I'm perfectly fine with starting low, but I'm always thinking about, okay, how do I make the next step up from here? Because I know that I can do it. And I'll make sure they figure it out too. So even if you feel a little twinge of ego at the idea of starting low, just be assured that you won't be there for very long. And finally, my fifth point is just don't try to figure this all out at once. This is not something that you wait until your 8th year at the end of your 3rd cycle on the market to try and suddenly say, well, gosh, what else might I do? That's why I'm so happy to see first years. It's something that you should hold in your head all the time, just thinking about all the possibilities of life, and academia being one among many. Because it is emotionally and it's psychologically difficult to leave academia. And no matter how many stories I tell you with happy endings about all these people being fulfilled and happy in what they've done, it doesn't make it any easier to think about leaving a universe that you've lived in for a decade or more and that you may have imagined as your place for the rest of your life. And I'm sure there are many of you who, like me, imagined that from childhood, that would be the place. So it's a big transition, and it's smart to keep that thought in the back of your head. But the happy thing is that it's only the first job that's difficult to find. Once you have one work experience outside academia, no one ever questions you again. It's just that first transition, that first change of career that can be harder. But after that, it's smooth sailing. So all of these techniques and tactics and psychological warfare that I'm describing are all about helping you make that first leap. But you should know that the world after that is no different for an academic than for anyone else. And in fact, I'd argue it's probably an easier path to navigate for academics than anyone else, because we have those kind of Iron Chef skills. So my final practical advice is just make plans 3 months at a time. Don't worry about the rest of your life. Don't commit yourself to some path. Don't, go take the LSATs tomorrow and decide that's your backup plan. Take 3 months and just bite off one of these examples. Go to a workshop. That'll be your thing for the 3 months. Or decide that you're going to look up 3 PhDs turned lawyers, and you're going to email them and just kind of get an idea of what is it really like. Do you really want to go to law school? What's it like to be a lawyer? Or maybe you're just going to track down a couple of people to send gracious notes to, or just track down a couple of alums from your department. But just set goals 3 months at a time. Do something simple, and just keep one foot, one toe on the outside. So you don't have to figure it all out tomorrow. But I do urge you to start thinking about it today. And that is the conclusion of my dramatic remarks, complete with light show. Thank you.